So why is it we want to discuss the transition to communism? Because to be honest, many of us in this room probably will not be participating as individuals in that by the time it comes about. Although hopefully some of you will. But it's important because what it does is outlines how we struggle today and what kind of a revolutionary party we want to build that in the future can help play the basis for the transformation. So it's important to get the politics straight. So to understand the transition period, we must first of all understand what the goal is. So just briefly, Karl Marx was a revolutionary. His goal was the replacement of capitalism by communism, not the superficial modification of capitalism. His critique of capitalism was extremely radical, covering gender and sexual relations, the relations of people to the environment, the overcoming of all forms of oppression, the radical democratization of all social relations, the abolition of all states, the elimination of private productive property, and the private ownership of children. He foresaw an international society with no money, no prisons, no oppression, no exploitation, no economic classes, and no borders. All this was connected at its core to the seizure of economic and political power by the working class, those who worked for a wage or salary. The communist society that was the end goal of working class struggle would be based on the principle that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Just as importantly, it would be an economy based on from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. As a revolutionary, he understood that the current capitalist or bourgeois state could not be used to bring about a communist society. Not only would the capitalists oppose communism with every weapon they had available, including their state power, but the essence of the transition to communism is, as he put it, the self-emancipation of the working class. At the core of the transformation of capitalism into communism is the transformation of the relations of production at work and in all other aspects of society. The real democratization can only happen when the recipients of democracy are its creators. For Marx, the first step on the road to communism was for workers to win the battle of democracy, as he put it in the Communist Manifesto. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx defined communism this way. After the enslaving subordination of individuals under the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and manual labor has vanished, after labor from a mere means of life has become the prime necessity of life, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be fully left behind and society inscribe on its banners from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So for Marx and Engels, this was a description of communism or scientific socialism. I want to stress here that, as far as I know, they made no distinction between scientific socialism and communism. To them, there was not a separate socialist phase or whatever. They were all one. For Marx, the road to his goal of communism was paved by the achievement of power by the working class. Only the working class had the potential, the interest and potential power to create communism. It was a class, as he put it, with radical chains. That is, if it threw away the chains, all of society would be thrown in the air. It had no form of property, no form of exploitation to impose. Its victory could lead to the abolition of economic classes. It was an international class, a collective class. Its conditions made it organized collectively, and therefore it was potentially a democratic class. It had the power and interest to create, it created all the wealth of capitalism, and it has the interest in fighting against exploitation. The struggle against exploitation leads to the struggle to abolish it. As Marx put it, what I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of classes. And later he said, and therefore the withering away of even the revolutionary state. So first of all, who is the working class? The working class is not just factory workers. It is all people who produce surplus value, who are exploited, create the capital that capitalists live off of. And it's also those people who create the conditions for the creation of surplus value. That is teachers, nurses, janitors, etc. In Marx's scenario, the first step was to win the battle of democracy, which he put forward in the Communist Manifesto. The first step in the revolution by the working class must be to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class. The proletariat becomes the ruling class of society. What did he mean by win the battle of democracy? He meant revolution. And in order to understand what that meant, we have to look briefly at the state today. The states today are capitalist states. They are run by and for the capitalist ruling class. States are committed to exploitation and to the oppression that maintains it. Ruling class and capitalist interests dominate the state through personnel at the top, to economic power of the capitalist class, and the state is forced to defend its home economy in a competitive world, and that means augmenting the power of capital. So what does revolution mean? And Marx talked about the need to smash the state. As he put it, the working class cannot simply take over the ready-made state machinery and use it for its own purposes. In discussing the Paris Commune, he said the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer as before to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. And it would be replaced with institutions directly controlled by the working class. This was done in the Paris Commune and also in the first few years of the Russian Revolution through the Soviets or workers' councils. This is what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. As he put it, between the capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And we need to stress here that he meant it was a working class dictatorship, not a dictatorship of an individual or a small group or an elite group or anything like that, but through the institutions of the working class, the whole class would rule. Today, we have what was called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or a capital dictatorship. Under a worker state, all the power would be then in the hands of the working class. The bourgeoisie would be dispossessed of political power. In Russia, they took it so far as to say that no one who was an exploiter would have political rights. They still had some residual economic power, but they would not have the rights to be part of the Soviet process. But for sure, it means that the working class dominates. If the bourgeoisie still has some kind of political power, it will use to augment its economic power and to thwart the transition to communism. We need to remember that the revolution and seizure of power does not immediately end classes. Capitalists and managers will be placed under workers' control, but they will still exist at least for a period of time. Capitalists and managers can use their residual economic power to subvert workers' democracy and the transition. Therefore, the working class must use its political power to control the enemy classes and undermine their economic power. There are other conceptions of transition to communism. Let's go through a few of these real quick. There was the idea of the educational dictatorship put forward by Blanqui, a French revolutionary. He felt that what should happen is that an incorruptible, well-intentioned elite should take power, and then they can educate the rest of society, educate the working class, and bring them up to their nice elite standards, and reshape the population from above. This educational dictatorship idea is actually still followed by Stalinists, Maoists, Castroists, etc. That is, a small group of people at the top run society, and they change society. And as Che Guevara put it, they create the socialist man. The Social Democrats, on the other hand, believe that socialism can come about by modifying capitalism, by reforming it, by using the capitalist state to move towards socialism. They rely on the capitalist state and politicians. The utopians, people like Owen and so forth in Marx's time, believe that setting up socialist communes can gradually spread the ideas of socialism across society, and that's how you make a transition. So what's wrong with these conceptions? Well, They are all based on elite interest of a small class at the top. The educational dictatorship of Blanqui or the Stalinist Maoist and Castros, small group of people at the top who run things. However, it's very clear that people who have that kind of unchecked power develop their own class interests, and therefore they're not going to pursue the interest of the working class. If the goal is democracy, this can only be achieved by democratic struggle. Workers must directly change and form the new relations of production. This cannot be dictated to them nor legislated to them, even by well-meaning legislators. Or as Marx put it, revolution is necessary not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because only in a revolution can the class overthrowing it succeed in ridding itself of the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. So this revolution process is absolutely essential to the creation of communism. There's one final conception of the transition, and that is the anarchist conception of no transition. That is, smash the state and have immediate communism. There are at least a couple problems with this. Workers need a state to overcome continual bourgeois resistance, which will not magically disappear the day after the insurrection. And we need a worker state to perform the many transformations to turn capitalism into communism. The anarchist idea is based on the idea that the only problem is authority. And once you get rid of authority, all is well. Which is, I believe, a naive view. We can get into that discussion. So now let's look at some of the tasks of the transition period. Class exploitation needs to be overcome. The worker state needs to expropriate productive property and make it collective working class property. We need to nationalize first the big parts of the economy under workers' control and then under self-management. Workers will control the capitalists, and over time they'll learn to actually directly manage industry themselves. We need to overcome the division between mental and manual labor, which is one of the sources of class division altogether, and that'll happen through the process of workers' control morphing over into worker self-management, among other processes. We need to overcome the division of income. Immediately after the revolution, of course, we'll raise the wages of the lower paid people, tax the more well-off, etc. And then over time, we'll make more and more necessities free, therefore not commodities anymore, but freely provided by society. And later, even the so-called luxuries will become free. And therefore, money will become less and less important until it withers away to the point where you don't need money anymore at all. With more abundance, there'll be less rationing, money will decline in importance, and so forth. There'll be job rotation, so people will not be stuck with one job for life or even for a week, as Marx talked about very clearly. We'll have to overcome the profit domination from competition. This drive for profit will still be there after the revolution, but as workers take over the commanding heights and begin to plan the economy and replace the market, the drive for profit will diminish. International competition too will decline as revolution spreads. The less competition there is, the less the drive for profit will dominate, and it will finally be ended when communism becomes international. As far as war and nationalism, the worker state will help to spread the revolution. However, immediately after an insurrection, there will still be need for military defense, and that will undermine the idea of meeting human needs. Over time, as military spending becomes less important because of the spread of the revolution, there will be more accentuation of meeting the needs of human needs. We'll need to overcome oppression. There'll have to be massive educational campaigns against racism, sexism, homophobia, on and on. But it'll take more than just educational campaigns. It will take an institutional restructuring, affirmative action on steroids, if you will, to break up the old job arrangements where certain groups of people have certain jobs. So everybody will have access to that. We know today with global warming, there'll have to be massive transformations of the energy system and every other aspect of the economy to make sure we continue to be able to survive on the earth. There will be debates over how this will be carried out. I believe there will be new political parties that will form. There will be robust debate, freedom of speech and press, etc. Because it's not going to be automatically obvious to everybody immediately what steps need to be taken. There'll have to be a debate over which way things will go. Now, how do we characterize this transition economy? I would say it is not socialism, but it is the revolutionary transformation of capitalism into communism, as Marx put it. The reason for this is that this stage between capitalism and communism is a transition between two different modes of production. There is no independent socialist mode of production in between capitalism and communism. There's just a transition between the two. In fact, the characterization of the transition period as socialism has benefited both social democracy and Stalinism. As the Labour Party leader in Britain, Anthony Crosland, put it, the socialist is a distribution of rewards, status, and privileges egalitarian enough to minimize social resentment, to weaken the existing deep-seated class stratification with its concomitant feelings of envy and inferiority. Or as Serres, a left-wing group in the Socialist Party of France, put it, define social democracy as a mass party bringing together the working class and middle classes so as to defend their interests without challenging the structures of capitalism. So the existence of this, or the ideology of the socialist stage, allows them to say, well, we may not be at communism yet, but at least we got socialism, so that's cool. Whereas for Marx, there was no such stage. By stalling the transition at the so-called social stage, they give up the battle for communism. Now, there are possible problems with the transition, of course. Once workers take power, there will be a dynamic in the direction of consolidation of democracy, workers' democracy, and towards the elimination of classes. However, the success of the transition is not inevitable, as we saw in Russia. If the revolution is isolated and so forth, it can be undermined. Capitalists and ex-capitalists will try to restore their power. If workers are not vigilant, a bureaucratic layer could build up with its own interest and undermine the transition. The residual capitalist economic power could undermine working class democracy. So this underlines, again, the importance of continual suppression of the bourgeoisie, the remaining bourgeoisie, and managers. We need to be sure that the transition period is a transition that is a dictatorship of the proletariat and not multi-class politics. The successful transition is not inevitable. It must be fought for. The working class will need to keep the tasks of the transition in mind and continue to fight for them. Over time, as classes disappear, the social problems are solved, the need for repressive apparatus declines. There's less and less need for repression of pro-capitalist forces. The worker state has less and less to do in terms of repressive apparatus until it withers away, totally. The battle for communism is necessary to save the human race and the planet. Our success is not inevitable, but it is entirely possible. Another world is possible. A socialist or communist world is possible. Marx's statement at the end of the Communist Manifesto is as applicable as ever. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chain. You have a world to win.